The silence in the house was the first betrayal. It was a deep, settled quiet, the kind that only comes when a space believes it is empty. Elias Vance stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, the scent of stale air and another person's perfume clinging to the fabric of the curtains. He had been gone for 4 days on a business trip to Chicago, a trip his wife Serafina had called another one of his little jaunts to sketch a new garage for someone. He was supposed to be gone for 7. But the final meeting had been a spectacular success, concluding 3 days early, and he had caught the first flight home, imagining Serafina's mild surprise, the slight annoyance in her eyes that he had disrupted her schedule, followed by the practiced, hollow kiss. He had walked into their home, a sprawling, modernist structure he had designed himself, and felt the stillness. He'd called her name. The only answer was the hum of the sub-zero refrigerator. He went upstairs, a knot of something cold and heavy forming in his gut. He dropped his own well-worn leather briefcase by the bed and went to the walk-in closet to hang his suit jacket. And that is when he saw it. It was tucked behind a row of Serafina's shoeboxes, almost but not quite hidden. A suitcase. A sleek, graphite-colored hardshell case with a garish, gold-plated handle. It screamed of new money and ostentatious taste. It was emphatically not his. His own luggage was a set of understated, durable pieces he'd owned for a decade. This suitcase was an intruder. It was a statement. It was the physical manifestation of a secret he had suspected but had refused to name. Elias stared at it, his heart not racing, but slowing to a heavy, painful thud. He thought their marriage was a structure with a failing foundation, weakened by years of subtle condescension and quiet neglect. He didn't know it was a facade, a hollow shell built on a bedrock of deceit. Within 24 hours, the carefully curated life they presented to the world would be dismantled, not by his discovery, but by the breathtaking arrogance of those who believed he was no threat at all. We have all felt that sinking feeling in the pit of our stomach, haven't we? That moment when you realize the reality you've been living in is not the truth. It's a feeling that connects us, no matter where we are. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Now let's go back and see how the cracks in this foundation began to show, long before a suitcase gave the game away. 3 weeks earlier, the air in the Croft family dining room was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and unspoken contempt. It was Eleanor Croft's 70th birthday, and the family had gathered in her palatial home, a place of suffocating floral wallpaper and overwrought mahogany furniture. Elias sat quietly, a ghost at the feast, while the conversation, steered by Serafina's brother Julian, swirled around him. Julian, with his perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, was holding court. "The Phoenix Project is the only game in town," Julian announced, slicing into his lamb with surgical precision. He was the CEO of Croft Holdings, the family's real estate development empire, a position he'd inherited, not earned. Whoever lands it will redefine the city's skyline for the next century. We're in the final running, of course. Our proposal is flawless. He glanced at Elias, a smirk playing on his lips. It's real architecture, you see, not community centers and residential additions. The jab was met with a ripple of polite laughter from the assembled cousins and aunts. Elias felt Serafina shift beside him. She didn't defend him. She never did. She simply took a delicate sip of her wine, her eyes fixed on her brother with an expression of adoration. She was a Croft first, and his wife a distant second. "Oh, Julian, leave him be," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false kindness. "Elias does important work. Every town needs its functional little buildings." She patted Elias's hand, her rings cold against his skin. "It's steady, I'm sure." Steady, functional, little. The words were stones dropped into the placid surface of Elias's composure. He had learned long ago that to react was to lose. He simply offered a small, neutral smile. "It pays the bills," he said, his voice even. Julian laughed, a loud, booming sound that filled the room. "Barely, from the looks of it. Serafina, darling, I do hope you'll let me buy you that new convertible. You can't be seen driving that sensible sedan Elias picked out. It's bad for the family brand." Elias felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, a righteous anger he had learned to transmute into fuel. He looked at his wife. She was beautiful, polished, a perfect product of her environment. And in that moment, watching her bask in her brother's arrogant glow, he felt an immense tectonic loneliness. She saw him not as her partner, but as an accessory she had to apologize for, a social liability. He reached down and his fingers brushed against the cool leather of his briefcase, which he'd placed carefully by his chair, the symbolic object. Inside were the preliminary designs for a project so vast, so ambitious, it would make the Phoenix Project look like a child's model. It was a secret he held close, a silent promise of a future they could not even conceive of. They saw a quiet, unassuming man in an off-the-rack suit. They had no idea he was the architect of their downfall, patiently drawing up the plans. The foundation of their world was already compromised, and he was the one who knew exactly where to place the charges. The dinner continued, their laughter and condescension washing over him. But for the first time, it didn't feel like an assault. It felt like a countdown. The humiliation was a slow drip poison, administered in small, polite doses over the years. Elias remembered a charity gala 2 years prior, an event Serafina had insisted they attend. "You have to network, Elias," she'd said, her tone implying he was incapable of understanding such a basic concept. "All of my family will be there." He had worn his best suit, a classic, well-tailored navy wool. It was understated, elegant, and timeless. But in the sea of glistening tuxedos and designer labels favored by the Croft Circle, it was deemed insufficient. He was standing by the champagne fountain when Julian approached, a cohort of his sycophantic friends in tow. "Elias, there you are," Julian had boomed, clapping him on the back a little too hard. "I was just telling my friends here about the importance of good design." He gestured expansively at Elias's suit. "Take this, for example. It's a study in minimalism. So minimal, in fact, that I almost asked you to fetch me a drink." His friends roared with laughter. Elias saw Serafina nearby, chatting with another socialite. She heard the remark. Their eyes met across the glittering ballroom. He saw a flash of embarrassment on her face, not for Julian's cruelty, but for him, for her husband, who was being compared to the waitstaff. She gave a tight, apologetic little smile and turned away, absorbed back into her conversation, leaving him alone in the wake of her brother's casual malice. In that moment, something within Elias had crystallized. It was the cold, hard realization that her loyalty had a price, and that price was social currency. He did not possess enough of it in her world. He was a deficit. Later that night, as they drove home in the sensible sedan Julian had mocked, she had been silent. "Are you all right?" he had asked, his voice quiet. "I'm fine," she'd replied, staring out the window. "It's just, Julian doesn't mean anything by it, you know. It's just how he is." It was the classic enabler's defense, the dismissal of his hurt, the normalization of the abuse. It was a secondary, more intimate betrayal. He didn't argue. He simply drove, the city lights blurring past the window. When they got home, he went into his study. He didn't sleep. He worked. He channeled the sting of that humiliation into the lines and angles of his designs, into the complex mathematical equations that formed the bones of his buildings. What Serafina and her family never understood was that Elias's modest work was a deliberate choice. He was the founder and sole silent owner of Vance Rossi Design, a firm that had, over the past 15 years, become one of the most respected and innovative architectural houses in the world. His partner, the brilliant and formidable Isabel Rossi, was the public face of the company. She handled the press, the galas, the networking. Elias preferred the quiet purity of the work itself. It was a pact they had made long ago, born from a promise to his late mentor, who had despised the cult of personality that grew around celebrity architects. "Let the work speak for you, Elias," he had said, "not your face on a magazine." And the work spoke volumes. Vance Rossi designed cutting-edge sustainable towers in Tokyo, breathtaking art museums in Dubai, and sprawling corporate campuses in Silicon Valley. The fees from a single one of those projects dwarfed the entire annual profit of Croft Holdings. Elias's net worth was a closely guarded secret, managed by a discreet team of financial advisors. He lived modestly, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He found luxury not in gold-plated handles or flashy cars, but in quality, in integrity, in the quiet satisfaction of a problem elegantly solved. His briefcase, the one he carried to the disastrous family dinner, contained the finalized acquisition documents for a massive tract of waterfront land. It was the very land designated for the Phoenix Project. While Julian was busy wining and dining city officials, Elias, through a series of anonymous shell corporations, had systematically bought out every single landowner over the course of 6 months. He now owned the board on which Julian was hoping to play his game of chess. Julian thought he was a king. He didn't realize he was a pawn on a board that Elias owned outright. Elias had sat at that dinner, absorbing their insults, feeling the weight of the documents in his briefcase, and understood the true meaning of power. It wasn't the ability to insult a man about his suit. It was the ability to own the ground beneath his feet and to let him believe, for just a little while longer, that he was still in control. The humiliation was not a wound. It was a whetstone, sharpening his resolve. Back in the present, the graphite-colored suitcase seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy in the quiet of the closet. Elias's initial shock had subsided, replaced by an unnerving, icy calm. The strategist in him took over. Rage was a wildfire, destructive and chaotic. What he needed now was the precision of a controlled demolition. He pulled out his phone, his movements fluid and deliberate. He didn't touch the suitcase yet. First, documentation. He took a series of clear, well-lit photographs from multiple angles. The suitcase in the closet, the distinctive gold handle, the brand name embossed on the side. Then, he put on a pair of leather gloves from his drawer. He carefully lifted the suitcase and carried it to the center of the bedroom, placing it on a sheet he spread out on the floor. He clicked the latches. They sprang open with an expensive, oily sound. The contents were exactly what he expected, yet the sight still landed like a punch. Neatly folded shirts from high-end designers, a DOP kit filled with colognes he recognized from sniffing them on Julian's ridiculously overpriced jackets, and at the bottom, a silk robe. On the pocket of the robe was a monogram, M.T. Marcus Thorne. Of course, the flamboyant, second-rate real estate developer who had been a thorn in Julian's side for years. Thorne was all flash and no substance, a man who built gaudy condominiums that began to fall apart within a decade. The irony was almost poetic. Serafina, so obsessed with status and pedigree, had chosen a man who was a caricature of everything her family claimed to despise. But Thorne was also a direct competitor. He had been bidding against Julian for several smaller projects recently, and an anonymous source had been feeding him inside information on Croft Holdings' bids, allowing him to undercut them at the last minute. The source, Elias now realized with sickening clarity, was sleeping in his bed. This wasn't just infidelity, it was corporate espionage wrapped in cheap silk. He photographed everything: the monogram, the specific brands of clothing, the contents of the DOP kit. He worked with the detached precision of a crime scene investigator, creating a digital file of evidence that was irrefutable. When he was done, he closed the suitcase, wiped it down to remove his own prints, and placed it back exactly where he had found it, behind the shoeboxes. The trap was set. Now he just had to wait for the quarry to walk into it. He sat down on the edge of his bed and made 3 calls. The first was to his personal lawyer, a quiet, ruthless man named Alistair Finch. "Alistair," Elias said, his voice low, "I need you to draw up divorce papers. Standard separation of assets, but include a non-disclosure clause with severe financial penalties. And I need you to start the process for activating Project Nightingale." Project Nightingale was the code name for the hostile takeover of Croft Holdings' primary creditor, a mid-sized investment bank they had been using for decades. It was a contingency plan Elias had put in place a year ago, a sleeping giant of financial leverage. The second call was to Isabel Rossi. "Isabel," he said, "it's time. I'm coming in." There was a pause on the other end, then her voice, crisp and clear. "I'll clear your schedule. And Elias, I'm sorry." She knew him well enough to understand that for him to make this call, a line had been crossed that had nothing to do with business. The final call was to the front gate security of their gated community. He instructed them to allow Isabel Rossi's car through when it arrived later that evening, and to log the exact time of arrival of Serafina's car. He was building a timeline, a meticulous record of the evening's events. He then walked downstairs to the living room. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished concrete floors. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat in his favorite chair, a classic Eames lounge, and faced the front door. He was a man waiting in his own home, which had suddenly become a theater. He was no longer just a character in the drama. He was the director. He could hear his own breathing, steady and even. He was not a man on the verge of a breakdown. He was a man on the verge of a reckoning. And it would be a quiet, orderly, and devastating affair. The quiet before the storm wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a presence, a weight. It was the intake of breath before the world changed forever. An hour bled into 2. The house grew darker, the shadows deepening from gray to black, until the only light was the cold, blue glow of the city skyline, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The silence was absolute. Elias sat motionless in his chair, a statue carved from patience and resolve. He had designed this room, this house. He knew its every echo, its every whisper of air through the vents. He had created it as a sanctuary, a testament to clean lines and honest materials. Now it felt like a stage, the setting for the final act of a long and painful play. Then he heard it, the distant crunch of tires on the gravel of the driveway, a car door opening, then another. Laughter, first Serafina's, a light musical sound that had once enchanted him, now grating and false. Then Julian's, loud and self-satisfied. Their voices grew closer as they approached the front door. "And I told him, if he can't handle the pressure, he should get out of the development game," Julian was saying, his voice oozing arrogance. "The man is a lightweight." "You're terrible," Serafina said, but her tone was admiring. The sound of a key in the lock. The heavy oak door swung inward, spilling the bright, artificial light of the porch into the darkened living room. They stepped inside, their silhouettes framed against the light. They didn't see him at first. "God, I need a drink," Julian said, tossing his keys into a ceramic bowl on the console table. "Celebrating our future success with the Phoenix Project is thirsty work." "The house feels weird," Serafina said, her voice dropping. She finally sensed the unnatural stillness. Her laughter died. She reached for the light switch. "Don't," Elias said. His voice, calm and quiet, cut through the darkness like a shard of glass. They both froze. Serafina let out a small, sharp gasp. Julian's head whipped around, his eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. "Elias?" Serafina's voice was a reedy whisper. "What are you doing sitting in the dark? You scared me. When did you get back?" Elias could see Julian's posture shift. The initial shock was already being replaced by his default setting, condescension. "Elias, back from designing another shed?" Julian's attempt at humor was weak, laced with unease. He squinted, trying to get a better look at Elias's face in the shadows. You should have called. We would have picked you up, though I suppose you're used to taking a taxi. Elias ignored him. His focus was entirely on his wife. He let the silence stretch, forcing her to fill it. Why are you home so early? She asked, taking a tentative step into the room. She was trying to read his expression, her own face a mask of nervous confusion. The predator sensing a change in the environment, a shift in the wind. My work concluded ahead of schedule, Elias said, his tone maddeningly neutral. He watched them, two figures caught in a spotlight of their own making. They were so confident in their roles, in the power structure they had built and maintained for years. They still believed they were on solid ground. They saw a strange situation, but they did not yet see a threat. Julian, ever the aggressor, decided to push. Well, turn on a light, man. It's like a tomb in here, he huffed, taking a step towards the switch himself. I prefer it this way, Elias said. There was a new edge to his voice, a filament of steel they had never heard before. It stopped Julian in his tracks. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear appeared in Serafina's eyes. The script had changed, and they didn't have their lines. The quiet of the room was no longer empty. It was filled with everything they had done, every lie, every insult, and it was closing in on them. Elias remained seated, a figure of absolute stillness in the heart of the encroaching chaos. The storm had made landfall. Elias let the heavy silence hang in the air for another 10 seconds, a suffocating blanket of unspoken truths. He watched Serafina's composure begin to fray at the edges, her hand fluttering nervously to her throat. Julian, however, puffed out his chest, mistaking Elias's quiet for weakness, as he always had. Right, well, if you're going to be morose, I'm getting myself that drink, Julian declared, turning toward the bar. Serafina, whiskey? No, Elias said, his voice still quiet but now carrying an undeniable weight of command. No one is getting a drink. You're both going to stand right there. Julian stopped and turned back slowly, a look of disbelief on his face. Excuse me? Who do you think you're talking to? Elias finally moved. He didn't stand, but simply leaned forward slightly in his chair, bringing his face into a sliver of moonlight from the window. His expression was unreadable, calm, and utterly devoid of the deference they were accustomed to. I'm talking to you, Julian, and to my wife, he said. He then shifted his gaze to Serafina, pinning her with a look that was not accusatory, but merely observational, as if studying a specimen. Serafina, a friend of yours appears to have left something behind. A suitcase. It's in our closet. I was hoping you could return it to him. This was the quiet bomb, a simple, devastatingly polite statement that vaporized the thin veneer of their reality. Serafina's face went pale. A suitcase? I don't know what you're talking about. Her denial was instant, reflexive, but her voice was thin, brittle. Oh, I think you do, Elias continued, his tone patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. It's a graphite-colored hard shell, a rather tacky gold-plated handle. I'm sure you've seen it. Julian stepped forward, inserting himself between them. It was his instinct to protect his sister, but also to dominate the situation. What the hell is this, Elias? Are you accusing my sister of something? You come home early, sit here in the dark like a creep, and start making insane accusations? Maybe those long hours designing your little projects have finally made you crack. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Julian, Elias said, his calm a stark contrast to Julian's blustering rage. I'm stating a fact. There is a suitcase in our closet that does not belong to me. I thought perhaps it was yours. Did you stay over while I was gone? The question was a verbal chess move, a beautiful, poisoned pawn. Julian was caught. If he said yes, he would be lying, and they would both know it. If he said no, he was admitting the suitcase belonged to someone else. Of course I didn't stay over, Julian snapped. Don't be ridiculous. Then we have a mystery, Elias said, leaning back in his chair again. He looked at Serafina. The suitcase contains several shirts from Italian designers. A bottle of cologne I believe is called Arrogance, quite fitting I thought, and a silk robe. The robe has a monogram. He paused, letting the word hang in the air. Serafina's breath hitched. She knew what was coming. The initials, Elias said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper, are M.T. The silence that followed was absolute. The name landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Serafina swayed slightly, as if she might faint. Julian's face, which had been a mask of indignant rage, was suddenly slack with shock. He knew the name. Of course he knew the name. Marcus Thorne, his rival, his nemesis, the man he considered a vulgar joke. The verbal chess match was over. It was a checkmate. Julian was the first to recover, his shock quickly curdling back into fury. But this time, it was laced with desperation. "You're lying," he hissed. "You're making this up to hurt her, to hurt us, because you're jealous of our success." "Am I?" Elias asked, his voice still unnervingly calm. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He swiped the screen and turned it toward them. The screen illuminated their shocked faces with its cold light. On it was a crystal-clear photograph of the open suitcase, the silk robe with the MT monogram displayed prominently on top. "Is this photo a lie too? I have others, many others. The suitcase in the closet, the contents. Shall I show you the one of the receipt from the hotel bar at the St. Regis, dated 2 nights ago, tucked into the side pocket? It was a very expensive bottle of champagne. I hope you enjoyed it, Serafina." Serafina let out a choked sob and sank onto the arm of the sofa, her face in her hands. The game was up. There were no more moves to make. The truth, in all its sordid detail, was laid bare in the cold, hard light of a phone screen. Julian stared at the phone, then at his sister, then back at Elias. His mind was racing, trying to find a new angle, a new way to regain control. He was a man who had never faced a problem he couldn't bully or buy his way out of. He fell back on his most trusted weapon, threats. "You listen to me," Julian snarled, taking a menacing step toward Elias's chair. His face was contorted in a mask of pure rage. "You will delete that. You will forget this. You will do it because if you don't, I will destroy you. You think your little firm can survive the pressure I'll bring to bear? I will call every supplier, every contractor, every city official you've ever worked with. I will have you drafting outhouses in the desert for the rest of your miserable life. You have no idea who you're messing with." It was his final, desperate gambit, the ultimate expression of his belief in his own power and Elias's insignificance. He stood there, panting slightly, his fists clenched, waiting for Elias to crumble, to beg, to do what he had always done, absorb the blow and retreat. But Elias didn't crumble. Instead, for the first time that evening, he smiled. It was a faint, sad, pitying smile. He looked up at the furious man towering over him, a man who had just threatened to destroy a shadow, completely unaware of the body that cast it. "My firm?" Elias asked, his voice laced with a gentle, almost academic curiosity. "You mean Vance Rossi Design?" The name hit Julian like a physical slap. Vance Rossi, the Giants, the international powerhouse that was whispered about in reverent tones in the boardrooms he so desperately wanted to dominate. He stared at Elias, his brain failing to connect the two concepts. The mousy, unassuming architect he'd mocked for years, and the legendary, almost mythical firm. What about them?" Julian stammered, his bravado evaporating like mist. "I'm so glad you've heard of us," Elias said, the smile never leaving his face. He slowly, deliberately, rose from his chair. For the first time he was standing, meeting Julian's gaze at eye level. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift. It underwent a seismic, tectonic reversal. "You see, Julian, you've been operating under a number of misconceptions. The first is that I am a man of no consequence. The second is that you are a man of great power. Let me correct them for you. He took a step closer, and Julian, involuntarily, took a step back. Vance Rossi Design isn't my firm in the way you mean, Elias continued, his voice as sharp and clean as a newly drawn blueprint. I don't just work there. I am Vance. I founded it 17 years ago. I am the sole, silent owner. My partner, Ms. Rossi, handles the public-facing duties because, frankly, I find people like you incredibly tedious. My personal net worth, which I have never felt the need to display, is roughly 50 times that of your entire family's holdings. And that's a conservative estimate. Serafina lifted her head, her face a mess of tears and utter disbelief. Julian was frozen, his mouth slightly agape, looking like a statue of a man who had just been struck by lightning. And the Phoenix Project, Elias said, delivering the coup de grace. The project you were so confident you would win. The one you said was real architecture. You were right about its importance. It will redefine the city skyline. He paused, letting the weight of his next words gather. Which is why I'm so pleased the board awarded the contract this morning. To me, to Vance Rossi Design. You see, while you were busy preparing your flawless proposal, I was busy buying the land it's going to be built on. You were never in the running, Julian. You were a minor nuisance I had to wait to clear from the board. He had used the moral mirror, holding up a perfect, unsparing reflection of their own arrogance. The man they had dismissed as insignificant had just revealed himself to be the god of their small, gilded universe. The silence in the room was no longer just silence. It was the sound of a world ending. The foundation of Croft arrogance, which they believed to be solid bedrock, had been revealed to be nothing but sand, and the tide had just come in. Julian stumbled backward, collapsing onto the sofa as if his legs could no longer support him. The color had drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, grayish pallor. He stared at Elias, his eyes wide with a horror that went beyond simple shock. It was the existential terror of a man who has just discovered that the fundamental laws of his universe were a lie. Serafina was now sobbing openly, not the quiet, dignified tears of a wronged woman, but the ugly, gasping sobs of a gambler who has lost everything on a final, foolish bet. Elias, I didn't know, she stammered through her tears. If I had known, I never would have. You never would have what, Serafina? Elias cut her off, his voice now cold, stripped of all pity. Respected me? Been faithful to me? Loved me? Your love, your respect, it was all conditional. It was contingent on a balance sheet I never showed you. The fact that you would have acted differently if you'd known the truth is the most damning indictment of all. Her pleading dissolved into incoherent mumbling. She had no defense. Her entire life had been a transaction, and she had just discovered she'd sold her integrity for a pittance when she could have had the whole kingdom. As if on cue, the doorbell chimed, a crisp, clean sound that cut through the thick atmosphere of despair. Elias glanced at the door, then back at the two broken figures on the sofa. That will be for me, he said. He walked to the door and opened it. Standing on the porch was Isabel Rossi. She was the physical embodiment of power. Tall, dressed in an impeccably tailored gray suit, her silver hair cut in a sharp, geometric bob. She radiated an aura of such competence and authority that Julian and Serafina seemed to shrink in her presence. She carried a slim, black portfolio under her arm. Isabel's eyes swept over the scene in the living room, Serafina weeping, Julian looking catatonic, and her expression didn't flicker. She gave them no more regard than she would a piece of furniture. Her focus was entirely on Elias. Elias, she said, her voice a calm, resonant contralto. Good evening. I hope I'm not interrupting. You're right on time, Isabel, Elias replied. She stepped inside, her heels clicking decisively on the concrete floor. The board of the Phoenix Project confirmed their unanimous decision less than an hour ago. They're ecstatic. They've already scheduled the press conference for Monday. They're ready for you to make the announcement, to finally step forward. She then placed the black portfolio on the console table. She unzipped it and pulled out a sheaf of documents. "And the acquisition papers for Sterling Merchant Bank are ready for your signature," she said, her voice dropping slightly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Sterling Merchant Bank, the Croft family's primary lender for 2 generations. "Once you sign these, we will control a majority stake. We will effectively own their debt, all of it." This was the second bomb, the one that targeted not just Julian's pride, but the very existence of his family's legacy. It wasn't just a loss, it was an extinction-level event. Julian made a small, strangled noise in the back of his throat. He understood immediately. Elias wasn't just taking his project, he was taking his company, his home, his past, and his future. Isabel held out a pen. "Shall we?" she asked Elias, as if they were the only 2 people in the room. The reversal of fortune was complete. The man they had mocked as powerless now held their entire world in the palm of his hand. Serafina was no longer pleading. She was staring at her husband, this stranger, with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Julian was not arrogant. He was a broken man, watching his dynasty crumble to dust before his very eyes. The waitstaff had just bought the entire restaurant. Elias took the pen from Isabel but didn't sign. Not yet. He turned his attention back to the wreckage on his sofa. The anger had passed, leaving behind a vast, cold clarity. This was not about revenge. It was about consequences. It was about balancing the scales that had been tipped for so long. He walked over and stood before Julian. "For years," he began, his voice low and measured, "you have treated me with nothing but contempt. You have mocked my work, my clothes, my car, my very existence. You did it because it made you feel powerful. You believed your wealth and your name gave you the right to diminish others." He then turned to Serafina, who flinched as his gaze fell upon her. "And you stood by and watched. You enabled it. You chose your family's arrogance over your husband's dignity, time and time again. You were ashamed of me, not for any flaw in my character, but because I didn't fit the shallow, materialistic world you worship." This was his list of grievances, delivered not with heat, but with the cold, hard finality of a judge passing sentence. Each word was a specific, cited transgression, a mirror forcing them to see the ugliness of their own behavior. "You once said I dressed like the waitstaff, Julian," Elias said, his voice dropping even lower. He echoed the insult from the gala, and Julian visibly winced, the memory a fresh sting. "Given the state of Croft Holdings' finances, which I am now intimately familiar with, you may soon be asking them for a job application. I hear the tips are quite good at the club." The parallel was brutal, a perfect inversion of the original humiliation. "You said my work was insignificant, Serafina," he continued, his eyes locking with hers. "That insignificant work just purchased the bank that holds your family's entire legacy in its hands. It will allow me to build hospitals and libraries and affordable housing for people who need it, long after the Croft name is a forgotten footnote in this city's history." He let that sink in. He was not just destroying, he was building something better from the ruins. He then walked over to his own leather briefcase, the one he had carried home from his trip, the one he had clutched during that humiliating family dinner. He opened it and pulled out a slim manila folder. He walked back to Serafina and placed it gently on the cushion beside her. "Those are the divorce papers Alistair drew up this evening," he said softly. "They are surprisingly generous. They will leave you with enough to live comfortably, though not extravagantly. There is, however, a non-negotiable, non-disclosure agreement. You will not speak of me, my business, or the details of our separation to anyone, ever." He paused. "That is one path. The other path involves this." He tapped his phone. "The evidence of your affair with Marcus Thorne. And not just the affair. Isabel's forensic accounting team has already found the digital trail, the emails, the documents you forwarded to Thorne from Julian's server, giving him the inside track on 3 separate bids over the past 8 months. Corporate espionage is a serious crime, Serafina. It carries prison time. He was giving her a choice, but it wasn't a choice between reconciliation and divorce. It was a choice between a quiet, dignified exit and total, public annihilation. It was the only mercy he had left to give. "Sign the papers," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Take the quiet path. Preserve the last shred of dignity you have left." He then turned to Isabel, who had been watching the entire exchange with the impassive focus of a hawk. He took the documents from her, placed them on the solid wood of the dining table, and with a firm, steady hand, signed his name. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of an empire falling and a new one rising from its ashes. The weeks that followed were a study in silent, efficient demolition. Elias moved out of the house the next day, leaving Serafina alone with the ghosts of her choices and a set of signed divorce papers. She signed them. There was no other option. The threat of public ruin and a prison sentence was a far more terrifying prospect than the loss of a life she now realized she had never truly appreciated. News of the Sterling Merchant Bank acquisition broke the following Monday, sending shockwaves through the city's financial community. It was announced by Vance Rossi Design's new, very public face, Elias Vance. The photographs that accompanied the article showed a man who looked nothing like the person the Crofts thought they knew. Dressed in a bespoke suit that spoke of quiet confidence rather than loud wealth, he looked directly at the camera with an expression of calm authority. He was no longer a shadow. The new ownership of the bank immediately called in its loans to Croft Holdings. The company, over-leveraged and poorly managed by Julian, had no way to cover the debt. It was a hostile takeover executed with the clean, brutal precision of a military operation. Within a month, the board was dissolved, and Julian was unceremoniously fired from the company his great-grandfather had founded. The name Croft was scrubbed from the letterhead, the building, and the city's consciousness. Elias attended the final meeting, the one where Julian was forced to hand over the keys. Julian was a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He had lost 20 pounds. His expensive suit hung off his frame. He didn't make eye contact. He slid the keys across the vast mahogany table of the boardroom he had once commanded and walked out without a word. The last Elias heard, Julian had sold the sprawling family mansion, the one with the suffocating floral wallpaper, and had moved into a small apartment, living off the dwindling remains of his personal savings. He was a king who had been stripped of his kingdom, forced to live among the commoners he had once despised. Serafina vanished. True to the NDA, she disappeared from the social scene. Her friends, creatures of opportunity and status, abandoned her as quickly as they had once flocked to her. Without the Croft name or Elias's newfound spectacular wealth, she was nobody. She was a ghost in her own life, living in a modest condo paid for by the divorce settlement, a gilded cage of her own making. Elias occasionally heard whispers about her from mutual acquaintances. She was lonely. She was regretful. But regret was not redemption. It was simply the price she had to pay. Elias, meanwhile, thrived. Stepping into the light suited him. He found that he enjoyed leading his team, enjoyed presenting his vision for the Phoenix Project, a breathtaking multi-use development that incorporated green space, public art, and a state-of-the-art performing arts center. He was hailed as a visionary, a genius who had been hiding in plain sight, but he never gloated. He never spoke of the Crofts or the reasons behind his sudden emergence. His victory was not in their downfall, but in his own ascendancy. He was focused on building, not on the ruins he had left behind. He had corrected a fundamental imbalance in his world, and now he was free to simply create. The past was a closed chapter, a set of architectural drawings for a structure that had been condemned and demolished. The future was an empty skyline, waiting for him to fill it. 6 months later, Elias stood in his new office. It occupied the entire top floor of a skyscraper in the heart of the city, a space he had designed for himself. It was the antithesis of the Croft mansion. It was minimalist, clean, filled with light and air. The walls were glass, offering a 360-degree view of the city he was reshaping. On a large table in the center of the room were the architectural models for his next major undertaking, a pro bono project to design and build a network of community centers and shelters in the city's most underserved neighborhoods. He looked out the window, down at the sprawling metropolis below. He thought back to the man who had sat in the dark, waiting for his wife and her brother to come home. He felt a sense of distance from that man, not because he was ashamed of him, but because he had completed his journey. He had not sought revenge in the way Julian would have understood it, a loud, brutal, public humiliation. He had sought justice, which was a quieter, more profound force. It was the restoration of truth. The triumph wasn't in their fall, but in his ability to rise without being pulled down to their level. He had maintained his integrity, his core principles. He had won the war without becoming the enemy. The true measure of a person's worth, he realized, is not found in the labels they wear, the cars they drive, or the balance in their bank account. It is not something that can be given or taken away by the judgment of others. True worth is forged in quiet integrity, in patience, in the unwavering commitment to one's own principles in the face of disrespect. It is an internal structure built on a foundation of character. The Crofts had built their lives on sand, and a single, unexpected tide had washed it all away. Elias had built his on bedrock, and he was just beginning to build. He turned away from the window and walked back to the table, picking up a miniature model of a library. He ran his thumb over its clean, elegant lines. He hadn't destroyed the Crofts to make himself feel powerful. He had dismantled a corrupt and hollow structure to clear the ground for something better, something that would last. His victory wasn't a final destination. It was a commencement. It was the freedom to use his hidden strength not as a weapon, but as a tool, to build a world that reflected his own values: strength, integrity, and quiet, enduring beauty. The suitcase was a catalyst, but the change had been waiting within him all along. He was finally, fully, the architect of his own life. Elias chose to build a better future rather than dwell in a broken past. A powerful reminder that our response to betrayal defines us more than the betrayal itself. What do you think is the most important lesson from his story? Is it the power of patience, the importance of integrity, or the simple satisfaction of seeing arrogance meet its match? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the incredible power of quiet strength and the ultimate triumph of character. We'll see you next time.